Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the For Food's Sake podcast. Today we talk about chocolate. Chocolate has been getting a lot of media attention lately, and not just because of Valentine's Day. In the last few months, we've been seeing a lot of media headlines that chocolate may actually be going extinct by 2050. Because of the effects of climate change, these articles suggest that we might soon be living in a world without chocolate. Now, in this episode, we decided to dig a little deeper and explore what actually lies behind some of these media headlines. We'll be discussing the world of chocolate with Simran Sethi. Simran is a journalist that has written extensively on food and social, environmental, and sustainability issues. She's also the best-selling author of Bread, Wine, and Chocolate, The Slow Loss of the Foods We Love, and the creator and host of The Slow Melt, an award-winning podcast all about chocolate. So without further ado, let's talk about chocolate with Simran Sethi. We have Simran Sethi on the podcast. Simran, welcome.
Thank you.
So it's very exciting to have you on the podcast here, especially on Valentine's Day. I think it's very appropriate that we talk about chocolate.
I agree, or any day.
Yes, exactly. Any day is a good day to talk about chocolate. But before we get into the nitty-gritty and what chocolate is all about and the many fascinating debates that we keep seeing pop up, especially in the media recently about chocolate. Let's start with you, Simran. A little bit about your background, maybe for those not so familiar with your work, and of course with your fantastic podcast, The Slow Melt.
Sure. So I'm a journalist. I actually write quite a bit about chocolate as well as other foods and drinks, but not from the recipe angle, but more from a broader perspective of kind of the role that these foods and drinks play in our life. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and I guess just over a year ago, I started a podcast called The Slow Melt, which I like to say is a thick, delicious lens through which to understand chocolate and the world. You know, we use chocolate as a thick, delicious lens through which to kind of explore the world. So everything from chemistry and geography to social justice and history, it's all kind of in there. And I'm very happy that the podcast was named Best Food Podcast by Savoir magazine for 2017. So, yeah.
Well, it is a fantastic podcast, and I'll try and see how much we can fit in here about chocolate. Maybe let's start with just, I guess, a quick crash course on what chocolate is. I mean, I guess it seems like a silly question, but there's so much to it. I mean, when we talk about cacao trees and cocoa beans, I'm not sure if, I certainly don't understand all of it. So maybe let's start there on what it is, what chocolate really is. What is it that we're talking about?
Absolutely. Balm of the heart, this incredible substance that brings us so much joy. And I, too, didn't really know the origins, despite the fact I had been eating it my whole life. And going on like 6 years ago, I maybe even longer, I visited my first chocolate forest, as it were. And I kept looking for this, brown substance that I had loved my whole life. And actually what chocolate is it's a product that starts with a tree called cacao. And the cacao tree sprouts pods, and these pods look like American footballs, or they're round like maybe a honeydew melon, and we eat the seeds. So these trees are grown 20 degrees north and south of the equator. And, again, when we kind of cracked the pod open, I was with farmers and a chocolate maker. I was really excited, like, okay, where's the chocolate? I guess it'll be bittersweet. There's no sugar in there, but I was quite convinced I would recognize it immediately. And we actually, the seeds are covered in a whitish pulp or mucilage, and that pulp has flavors that range from kind of peanut brittle to lemon to melon. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. The seeds that are inside, of the pulp are bitter, they can be kind of a light tan in color, or a light purple, or even a darker purple, and they're quite astringent, which I wasn't expecting, because really to become chocolate requires that seed to go through many processes. So the cacao pods are harvested, the seeds and the pulp are pulled out, they're fermented, a lot of that pulp kind of melts away. The seeds are then dried, they're sorted, they're shipped, again they're sorted, then they're roasted, and then from there, the chocolate maker has taken over shelling these seeds. We lose about 1/3 of the weight once they're shelled. They're blended together, they're tempered, any additional ingredients are added, and then they're molded and they're finally made into chocolate bars. So it's quite a labor-intensive process, and typically these processes are decoupled. So you'll see that cacao is grown, in this kind of equatorial belt, but it becomes chocolate in the global north. So we've seen kind of this very big markup between the raw material, the actual crop, and then the end product. And slowly, those things are coming together as there are more chocolate makers at origin, which to me is one of the most promising and exciting and delicious kind of things that's happened in the last few decades, and a lot more just, in the last 5 or 10 years. So that's kind of what chocolate is.
Wow.
And historically it was used as currency. It was originated in the Upper Amazon, but it was domesticated in Mesoamerica. And the Aztec and Maya used these incredible cocoa beans as currency. They were used in sacred rituals, and then they became this kind of other substance when they were transplanted, or I should say, moved to Europe as kind of the spoils of the Spanish conquest.
Yeah, and now today, I mean, are they still predominantly grown in South America, or are they? I'm also aware that increasingly they're grown in West Africa. Is it nowadays?
Yes, actually. So in that equatorial belt, 20 degrees north and south of the equator, all along it, 60 to 70% of our cacao is now grown in West Africa, predominantly in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. But you find cacao in Vietnam, Papua New Guinea, Hawaii, in the United States, all, through Central and South America. It's quite extraordinary to see these origins popping up, and to see different places growing the crop. I think, what's interesting is historically there has not been any sort of culinary tradition associated with cacao. So for many farmers in West Africa in particular, it's a crop they don't have a deep cultural or emotional association with. And when you couple that with kind of this very depressed market and low wages, you can understand why it's something that there's sort of not been paid a lot of attention to. So I hope, again, that's something that's changing as we see a small, but important market being developed in places like Ghana, and a real, I should say, concerted effort throughout the cocoa industry to really encourage that local consumption.
Right. Yeah. And as I understand it, I mean, the way it's grown today, it's still a very manual and laborious process, right? I mean, the farmers that are growing it today, as you mentioned, I mean, could you talk a little bit about the farmers and who they are and why, I guess, they're growing it as well?
Absolutely. So I'm really glad you asked about farmers. Makers get a lot of the attention, but this beautiful substance would not exist without farmers. According to a study that was done by Oxfam, farmers get roughly 6 cents for every dollar that we spend on a chocolate bar. So there's many ways that they're kind of overlooked. The majority of cacao, about 90%, is grown by smallholder farmers. So they're growing very small amounts of cacao that is then typically processed in a centralized location. So in order to ferment cacao properly, you need a sizable mass of it, right? So these distribution centers will take this glorious cacao and then ferment it all together. These farmers vary. I don't want to kind of describe them as a singular kind of entity. Farming in a place like Ghana is very different than farming in a place like Trinidad. In Central and South America, we see a lot of families working together, and there's certainly a huge problem with child labor in the cocoa industry. And I think what is also something that we are aware of is that because these are family kind of endeavors in certain areas, that often you will see younger children participating. So I think, again, it's just a matter of not kind of like looking at all of this with a little bit more nuance, and kind of understanding the cultural context. But for the most part, this isn't a crop that's making a lot of people rich, at least not on the, on the kind of crop end of the supply chain. But there is this extraordinary history, and we tend to think about cacao, or chocolate, I should say, as being this one substance. But there was a study that was led by a plant geneticist named Juan Carlos Montemayor, and he and his team actually identified 14 genetic clusters of cacao. So the diversity kind of in this crop, and since then they've continued to identify more and more. So we're seeing, in these last years, a real kind of turn toward an exploration of cacao as a substance that has a taste of place. This sense of terroir is something that we would talk about in wine grapes, for example, or in cheese, or now increasingly in coffee. Like, that's sort of a way to help distinguish the places where the crop is grown, and I think a way to really start to highlight and celebrate the farmers behind it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I really appreciate that point you made about the fact that it's a seasonal product, has a lot of diversity, and I really want to touch maybe a bit later on as well on how we as consumers can differentiate and can really support farmers through our action. But before we talk about that, and you mentioned this as well, we often overlook the farmers, and this very much, one of the reasons I really wanted to do an episode on chocolate here is the sensationalist headlines we've been seeing recently, or at least what I consider quite sensationalist headlines, is that chocolate is going to go extinct by 2050 due to climate change. You're seeing from quite reputable sources, Al Jazeera, Forbes, Huffington Post, and ABC News. They're all talking about either global warming changing the taste of chocolate, to a world without chocolate, that cacao is going to disappear. To I even saw headlines really playing on talking about a chococalypse or a chocageddon, and basically, I guess, almost playing on the fears of consumers. Not in for the fears of the farmers, as we mentioned. They're often very much ignored, but very much this is touching upon people's emotions, as chocolate being a comfort food, a guilty pleasure at worst, that people very much appreciate and consider dear. And so I guess my next question would be, what can we take away from these headlines? And is there any truth behind, the link between climate change and cacao and chocolate going, quote unquote, extinct?
This is such a great question. Yes, and maybe, but not necessarily in that order. Okay, so let me break down kind of a bit of what you just said and refresh my memory if I miss anything. The idea that chocolate will go extinct as a result of climate change is a sensational headline. It's eye-catching. It strikes fear in the heart of every chocolate lover. No, not my chocolate. But let's be clear. The IPCC has determined that a warming planet will have a dramatic impact on agriculture, and the impact is largely negative. And so this will, of course, affect cacao. Cacao grows right next to the equator, so it's already warm there. If it gets warmer, we're going to have problems sustaining this crop. Now, of course, we could say we can, move it elsewhere, which is certainly what will in part happen. But we also see, as we see with all other kind of foods and drinks, that plant geneticists are working very hard to develop drought-tolerant varieties of these foods that we love. Now, I wrote a book on the loss of agricultural biodiversity. When I was initially writing the book, this is a digression, but it'll make sense in a second, I was going to write about rice and corn and, potatoes, these foundational foods that feed the world. I ended up writing about bread, wine, coffee, chocolate, and beer, and the genetic erosion and loss of agricultural biodiversity through these foods, for the exact same reason that journalists will take these dramatic headlines, right? okay, well, I don't eat many potatoes. I'm not going to miss potatoes, but don't touch my beer. That sort of a thing, right? So let's just be clear, like that one thing is being identified and it gets really catchy. And that's the kind of story that, editors really love. But we can kind of apply this general notion of loss to all foods and drinks. Now, the specificity around cacao is this. The crop is a crop that requires a kind of steamy environment in which to grow. I use the word steamy because that's what it feels like when you're in a cacao forest. It is hot. It is humid. The ideal way to grow cacao is in a diversified, agroforestry system. So you've got, nice shade trees, but you've got this kind of dense, teeming forest. Now, we also see this move toward plantations, monoculture cacao plantations, which is not ideal for a number of reasons. But you can certainly imagine that, as things get warmer, that is going to be compromised. But I think one of the things that's most challenging is that some of this information has been put out in a very inaccurate way. So you mentioned flavor, and there was a study that was done that looked at kind of the impacts of drought. Specifically, it was the impacts of drought and temperature on cacao beans and on the kind of organoleptic profile. So how would it impact kind of the things that contribute to flavor? Now, if you only read the press release and didn't really look closely, you might come away with the idea that the flavor of chocolate would get better. But that's not what the study said. I actually wrote an article about this because I was so horrified that this is how it was being reported. And, it's one thing for me to be horrified, but it's another thing altogether for the researchers to be horrified. And they felt like the work was really misrepresented. That is not what will happen under climate change. So we shouldn't sort of feel like there'll be any solace with a warming planet. We do have, opportunities to intervene. And I think that's kind of what the greatest takeaway should be from these sort of headlines, that we again need to intervene and do whatever we can to kind of reduce this trajectory or mitigate the trajectory that we're on regarding a warming planet and temperature increase. So, but another thing I think that we should also add to this conversation around climate change is that one of the ways that we kind of mitigate these impacts and sequester carbon is through forests. One of the largest causes of greenhouse gas emissions is deforestation.
Yes.
And cacao is directly connected to this. I mentioned that, the places where cacao grows predominantly are in West Africa. There was research conducted last year by an NGO based in Washington, D.C. called Mighty Earth. And what they discovered is that Ivory Coast has lost around 85% of their forests since 1990, and Ghana's lost about 60% of their forests. Okay, this is terrible. Forests are, the rich areas where we find biodiversity. They're the place that kind of helps mitigate climate change. They're incredibly important. But the surprising part of this discovery, as the campaign director told me, Etel Igone is her name, is that the reason that we are losing it is because of cacao. And so even within areas that have been allegedly protected, we see this push to grow cacao and this kind of turning the head and allowing this stuff to proliferate. So that's kind of another piece that isn't getting reported enough right now, is that cacao is a major contributor to deforestation, and deforestation is a major, contributor to climate change. And that is a much more immediate challenge that we're facing.
Yeah, definitely. And like you mentioned also, I mean, your book must touch upon this as well, but the loss of biodiversity with these deforestation must be enormous as well, let alone, the impacts of climate change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think what also gets lost in some of these discussions is like the immediate challenges aren't maybe as like danger and far away, right? If I tell you that climate change is going to destroy cacao by 2050, you can still happily munch your, Kit Kat bar and be okay. Like, what am I going to do? But if I say to you, farmers today are leaving this industry because they can't make enough money to feed their families, then that requires an immediate action, right? An immediate response. And that's really the reality of this situation. Yes, we absolutely need to worry about climate change, but the immediate pain for these farmers is the fact that over the last year, since right around Valentine's Day, the market dropped, the bottom dropped out of the commodity cacao market by 1/3. So these are farmers that are already at the margins. In Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, these farmers make anywhere between $1 and $2 a day. And you can imagine if they're losing 1/3 of the earnings from this crop as the market drops, like how devastating this is. Cacao isn't a crop like wheat. It's not something that you can store and hold back when the price drops. It's something that has to be sold right away. So there's not a lot of power here. And just within the last week or so, the Cocoa Board of Ghana said that they would no longer be able to guarantee prices in upcoming harvests for farmers. So again, that's another blow to this industry. So the challenge is that farmers are aging out. Younger farmers don't want to keep growing this crop. The kind of investment it takes, depending on kind of where you started, it takes, roughly 5 to 7 years for this tree to mature. So it's a lot of front end investment. It's a lot of labor, any inputs that might be put into the crop. It's all of that time. And then to come out of it and realize that you're not even going to be able to make enough money to cover those expenses must be devastating. So right. You see farmers turning toward, in Ghana, small scale mining, illegal mining. You see farmers turning towards growing rubber. I mean, you see all kinds of things happening because people need to make a living, not in 2050, not in 5 years, today.
Yeah, that's I guess the horrible irony behind growing cacao is the fact that you have that, like you mentioned, that production lag, and the fact that when you have oversupply, when you have too much, it drastically drops the prices, and the people that bear the brunt of that, of course, is the farmers.
Exactly. And this is the perversion of economics, right? Right. The narrative recently has been like, danger, danger, climate change is going to kill your chocolate. Well, a couple of years ago it was danger, danger, we're going to run out of chocolate because China and India are going to eat it all up, right? Their appetite is growing. Well, the reason the market dropped is because we are now in a state of oversupply. All these farmers responded to what these market analysts said. They responded to all this media hype, and they put a lot more cacao in the ground, right? And so then it turns out, wow, Mother Nature was beneficent, and the crop actually grew well, and they had these bumper harvests, right? And again, only in kind of this perverted way is like, having a great harvest and growing, working really hard and then having a lot come out is going to be kind of counterproductive. So now we're in a state of oversupply. And again, what that means is that farmers are going to stop growing as much cacao. And again, the market will adjust. And what it also seems is happening is the weather will not be quite as favorable. So, and there's also disease to contend with. The disease, there are losses in the cacao crop of about 30-ish% due to disease. So there's a lot of risks that go into this. And I think, I feel like in my work, my job is to really shed light on this as a way to help people appreciate this glorious substance a little bit more.
Yeah. And it's also sad to see that, when you look at, we touch upon this a little bit, but at the global soft commodity markets and the fact that, futures markets are supposed to, I guess in essence, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about this, is protect farmers, right? Protect farmers from these, uncertainties, these volatile prices. But what we're seeing in reality really is the people benefiting most from these, volatile price changes are London-based or New York-based, Chicago-based in the case of soft commodities, traders that are speculating from these price changes.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing for me. I feel like one of the greatest challenges is, the contracts are ideally supposed to work in farmers' favor. However, what we've seen, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire the people defaulting on those contracts, right, when the price got so low. And this is a group of people that, these farmers are not don't tend to be organized. In the labor sense of this, there's not a lot of power there. So, and I think then you have these, these traders that are very far away from the daily lives of these farmers. So it creates a situation, much like we see even with consumption, where that distance really breeds almost, dare I say, indifference. There's just only so much that we can worry about, and a commodity is something that is bought and sold, but it doesn't represent the kind of the sweat equity and the love and the care and the time and the energy and the risk that actually goes into growing the crop.
And just quickly, for those not so familiar with futures markets, I mean, those are very much, at least historically, designed for agriculture, right? They are contracts where you set a fixed price for said commodity, at which the buyer will buy from the seller, regardless of seasonality and all the other fluctuations you get in price.
Assuming that contract isn't then again retraded. And in terms of the history, I'm actually I'm not a futures expert, so I don't know if that's the origin of the actual mechanism. But I think it's a very interesting thing to kind of see how disconnected the average farmer. I in my work for my book, I actually focused on trading in the chapter I did on coffee, and I was in Ethiopia, and it's like, there are signs everywhere. This was eventually mandated that there be signs so farmers actually knew the actual rate at which coffee was traded, again, on the commodities market. But no such requirements exist that I'm aware of in cacao. So these farmers are selling their product to these middlemen who, and I use the word men deliberately. This is overwhelmingly men who are the ones who are kind of doing that middle processing. But they don't have any sense of the market. Some of these folks are in really remote areas, and it's not information that's necessarily readily available. If it is, again, they don't necessarily have the power to influence it in any way. And because of the immediacy of the crop, there's a sense that you're gonna offload it for whatever you can.
Yeah, I read this really fascinating article. I'm not sure if you heard of a specific trader called Anthony Ward. They called him, he got nicknamed the Chalk Finger. I think he was a London-based trader. And he kind of made his name, I mean, if I understood correctly, in the early 2000s by purchasing, it was 150,000 tons of cocoa, which was something like 5% of the global supply, and then kind of holding that back a bit and essentially making, millions of pounds, by selling it back into the market after the prices surged, which is just, I guess, a little anecdote of how, incredible this really is, how disconnected the markets really are.
Exactly. And I think he's now said he's leaving cacao trading because it's no longer financially lucrative for him, right?
Right. Yeah. I wanted to also ask about, so we touched upon this briefly, but the role that, the companies, they've made some commitments to become more sustainable, but also the fact that a lot of these companies are turning towards biotechnology, and I saw specifically here with crops, a lot of companies see a lot of promise in CRISPR-Cas9 technology. Could you talk a little bit about the role that biotechnology could have in mitigating some of these effects for climate change, and ultimately perhaps also helping the farmer?
Right. So this touches, the idea of developing climate resilient cacao beans, right? Ones that would be more resistant to kind of a warming planet, but also ones that would be more pest and disease resistant. And I said earlier, 1/3 of the crop is lost to disease. I should have said to pests and diseases together. So what's happening is actually Mars Incorporated, which is one of the world's largest chocolate producers, has been working with researchers from Berkeley's Innovative Genomics Institute. And they're trying to breed this kind of super resilient variety of cacao. And they're using a suite of genetic engineering tools, and that includes what's known as CRISPR. So what these scientists are doing is they're taking cells from the petal of the cacao blossom. That tiny little blossom looks like a tiny white orchid. It's about the size of your pinky fingernail. They're sterilizing these petals to kill off any sort of fungi or germs, and then they're placing those single plant cells into culture dishes. And then from there, they use gene editing tools to kind of create mutations within the DNA that's inside of the cells. So, and then those cells would grow into cacao trees. So what we're seeing is like a kind of precision genetic engineering that didn't used to exist. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, really, because of course the hope is, as you said, that this is going to create trees that will help some of these smallholder farmers really be able to sustain the crop moving forward.
And so this is CRISPR-Cas9. This is one of the technologies.
Yes.
Okay. And I guess that brings me to one of my last points, which is that, of course, you've got the markets on the one hand playing a role. You've got the big food companies, but then of course also there's us ultimately, right? There's the consumers, and I'm sure that on Valentine's Day or just in general, when you talk about the last thing you want to do, or maybe this is what you do want to do, is guilt trip people when they're buying chocolate, which is supposed to be the ultimate comfort food, that one sweet that's supposed to also be healthy for you and positively affect your mood, and it's that kind of one thing you can turn to. And here we are talking about the climate repercussions and all the negative effects of chocolate. So I guess my final question here is related to what we can do as consumers in a positive way, not just guilt tripping consumers into, putting chocolate on their list of a long list of things they shouldn't be buying anymore because it's destructive to the environment. But, how can we empower consumers to really, help farmers, help chocolate, cacao farmers, but also still buy chocolate to kind of, I guess, push the movement forward in a positive light?
I want to use chocolate as the kind of substance, but again, say this extends to all agriculture. Hunger is a very real issue, and I don't want to undermine it in any way, but I do also want to say that this drive to the bottom is hurting farmers. It is compromising biodiversity, and it is making our food less delicious, quite frankly, and less healthy. So, one of the biggest things we can do is start to rethink what chocolate is to us. Chocolate has been my constant companion, right? We're talking on Valentine's Day. I've had chocolate every single Valentine's Day. I may not have had a partner, a beloved, a Valentine outside of myself being my own best Valentine, but I have had chocolate. Now, for that, I think to myself, when I grew up, this is something I've always thought of paying like $1 for. What can you actually get for that amount of money? And I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves. As consumers, we should start trying to understand where that money goes, A, and B, trying to support some of these chocolate makers that are really working towards more direct trade models. So that is for in large part, craft chocolate. Those are some of the smaller makers, the ones that are talking about origins, the ones that are telling you the story of the farmers, that have a different kind of commitment to kind of the beginning of the supply chain. Certifications are great. We don't have time to kind of go through all of them now, but I will say that in the absence of kind of anything, if you're looking at kind of a mass-produced chocolate bar, look for a certification. It's a great floor, right? But if you're looking at some of this more expensive chocolate, many of those makers have chosen not to opt for those certifications. Those certifications are actually quite costly for farmers and farmer cooperatives, and they're also costly for makers. And, I think a lot of people think when they see a chocolate bar that costs $10 that someone must be getting really rich, but the margins aren't that different. I mean, they are very thin on kind of both ends there. So typically, farmers might make a little bit more money depending on kind of who the maker is. They might have a stronger direct relationship with the chocolate maker, the farmers may, and also that maker has a different kind of relationship to the product. So you had mentioned earlier this sense of seasonality in the crop. What I encourage people to do is try some craft chocolate, and is to consider chocolate in the way we consider wine. You would never think about paying you kind of know what you're getting when you buy a very, very cheap kind of wine, right? So what does it mean to make a deeper investment? What does it mean to celebrate seasonality, to celebrate this idea of terroir, right? And to also hold the capacity for something not to be the same all the time. We would never expect, vintage after vintage after vintage of a Chardonnay to be the same, right? So can we kind of open ourselves up to this world of chocolate, to a sense of serendipity and curiosity, and fundamentally to a sense of reverence?
That's fantastic. Simran, thank you so much. Is there somewhere where people can find out more about your work, follow you on Twitter, just maybe read your book as well?
Absolutely. All of the above. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Simran Sethi. That's SimranSethi. You can find my book all over the world, actually. It's called Bread, Wine, Chocolate, The Slow Loss of Foods We Love. And you can follow the podcast. The podcast is theslowmelt.com. And I do a lot of speaking engagements all around the world. So if you want to catch me there, you can check out the presentation page on my website, which is simransethi.com.
Simran, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can find the links to all of Simran's work in the show notes below of this episode. That's to her website, Twitter and Instagram, her book, and her podcast, The Slow Melt. And I've also added a few extra resources, a few articles that I found interesting on chocolate in the show notes below. That is it for now, guys. As always, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by subscribing via iTunes, by rating and reviewing the show via iTunes. You can find, stream, and listen to the podcast on all of your favorite podcast apps, or you can go directly to our website, that's www.forfoodsake.me, and stream them directly from there. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The social media handle for all those platforms is For Food's Sake Me. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.